Something unprecedented is unfolding on the global stage right now, and it's not coming from traditional diplomatic channels or carefully choreographed international summits. 1 minute ago, reports emerged that Donald Trump has made a foreign policy demand so audacious, so fundamentally at odds with decades of American diplomatic practice, that it's triggering explosive reactions from allies and adversaries alike. And this isn't just another Trump campaign promise that experts dismiss as unlikely to be implemented, or another provocative statement designed purely for domestic political consumption. This is a specific policy demand communicated through back channels to foreign governments, one that threatens to upend long-standing alliances, embolden authoritarian regimes, and force America's closest partners to make impossible choices about their relationships with the United States. Stay until the end, because what's happening here goes far beyond one controversial foreign policy position or one diplomatic controversy. It's revealing how Trump would approach international relations if returned to power, how allies are preparing for the possibility of a second Trump presidency, and how the global order that has existed since World War II is being fundamentally questioned not just by America's adversaries, but by a former president who may soon return to office. And if you want to understand why foreign capitals are in emergency sessions right now, and why this demand has sparked reactions that nobody predicted, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss analysis of the seismic shifts reshaping America's role in the world. So imagine this moment, late last night in capitals across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Foreign ministers receiving urgent communications from their intelligence services or from diplomats stationed in Washington, reporting on conversations they've had with Trump's advisors or with Republican lawmakers who have been briefed on Trump's intentions. And the substance of what's being communicated isn't a proposal for negotiation or a framework for discussion. It's described as a demand, a non-negotiable position that Trump intends to implement immediately if he wins in 2024, regardless of how allies respond or what the consequences might be for decades-old treaty commitments. And the immediate reaction among foreign policy establishments in allied countries is something between disbelief and alarm, because the demand Trump is reportedly making strikes at the foundation of how America has engaged with the world for generations. It questions whether the United States will continue to honor mutual defense commitments. It suggests that American military presence abroad should be contingent on host countries meeting financial terms that Trump considers acceptable. And it implies that long-standing alliances are transactional relationships that can be renegotiated or abandoned based on Trump's assessment of whether America is getting a good deal. And that's where the explosive global reaction begins, because allies who have built their entire security strategies around American commitments are suddenly confronting the possibility that those commitments might be conditional or even withdrawn. NATO members in Eastern Europe who face direct threats from Russia are recalculating their security positions. Asian allies like Japan and South Korea, who rely on American military presence, are engaging in contingency planning. And Middle Eastern partners who have structured their regional policies around American support are exploring alternative arrangements. Now let's examine what Trump's foreign policy demand actually entails, because understanding the specifics is essential to grasping why the global reaction has been so explosive. And while some details remain unclear because the communications have been through unofficial channels, the core elements are becoming visible through reporting from multiple sources in different countries. The demand centers on what Trump calls burden sharing, but it goes far beyond traditional debate about NATO defense spending targets. Trump is reportedly insisting that countries hosting American military bases pay the full cost of that presence, plus a premium for the security benefits they receive. And we're not talking about modest cost-sharing increases. Sources suggest Trump is demanding payments that could amount to billions of dollars annually from individual countries, increases of several 100% over current arrangements. But the financial component is only part of the demand. Trump is also reportedly insisting on fundamental changes to how alliance relationships function. He wants allied countries to align their policies more closely with American preferences on trade, on technology transfer to China, on immigration, and on various other issues. And he's making clear that American military commitments, including the nuclear umbrella that protects allies, would become conditional on compliance with these demands. And what makes this particularly explosive is that Trump isn't presenting this as an opening negotiating position. According to foreign officials who have received these communications, Trump's representatives are describing this as a take it or leave it proposition. Countries can accept the terms and maintain security relationships with America, or they can decline and face the prospect of American withdrawal from treaties and from military installations that have existed for decades. Now, Trump's defenders argue that this approach is overdue, that American taxpayers have been subsidizing wealthy allies' defense for too long, and there's legitimate debate about burden sharing within alliances. But what's controversial isn't the goal of more equitable burden sharing. It's the method Trump is proposing and the implications of conditioning treaty commitments on financial payments, because alliances aren't supposed to be protection rackets where security guarantees can be bought and sold. They're supposed to be based on shared values, common interests, and mutual commitments. Now let's examine the specific reactions from key allies, because the explosive global response isn't uniform. Different countries in different regions are responding in ways that reflect their particular security situations and their historical relationships with the United States. Start with NATO allies in Europe. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states that face direct threats from Russia are in crisis mode. They've built their entire post-Cold War security strategies around NATO membership and American commitment to collective defense. And now they're confronting the possibility that America might demand payments they can't afford or might condition security guarantees on terms they can't accept. So they're urgently consulting with other NATO members about collective responses and about what alternatives might exist if American commitment can't be relied upon. Western European allies like Germany and France are responding differently. They're less immediately threatened by Russia, and they have more resources to potentially meet Trump's financial demands if necessary. But they're deeply concerned about the principle of conditioning alliance commitments on payments and about what this signals about American reliability. And they're accelerating discussions about European strategic autonomy, about building military capabilities that don't depend on America. Asian allies face their own unique challenges. Japan and South Korea host substantial American military presence and rely heavily on American deterrence. But they're also economically sophisticated countries with the resources to meet Trump's financial demands if they choose to. The question for them is political. Can their governments justify paying what amounts to tribute to maintain American security guarantees? Will their publics accept what would look like extortion from an ally? And Middle Eastern partners are conducting their own calculations. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have complex relationships with the United States that combine security cooperation and energy policy. They're financially capable of meeting almost any demand Trump might make, but they're also exploring hedging strategies, strengthening relationships with China, and questioning whether American commitments are reliable enough to base their long-term security planning on. What's striking is that almost no ally is publicly defending Trump's approach or suggesting that his demands are reasonable. Even countries that are most dependent on American security and most willing to consider increased payments are privately expressing alarm, and that near universal concern among allies is itself significant. Now let's examine how America's adversaries are responding to Trump's foreign policy demand, because their reactions are equally revealing and equally concerning, because countries like Russia, China, and Iran aren't alarmed by Trump's approach to alliances. They're encouraged by it, and you can see this most clearly in how Russian state media and Russian officials are responding. They're not condemning Trump or warning about the dangers of his approach. They're amplifying his criticisms of NATO. agreeing that European countries have been freeloading off American security and suggesting that Trump is right to question whether these alliances serve American interests. And the reason Russia is promoting this narrative is obvious. Anything that weakens NATO, that creates doubt about American commitment to collective defense, that encourages European countries to question whether they can rely on the United States, serves Russian interests. Chinese responses are more subtle but equally opportunistic. Chinese officials are reaching out to American allies in Asia, suggesting that while the United States treats alliances as transactional relationships, China offers stable partnerships based on mutual benefit. They're positioning China as a more reliable long-term partner than an America that might elect leaders who view alliances as protection rackets. And they're using Trump's demands to argue that the era of American global leadership is ending. And Iran is making similar calculations in the Middle East. Iranian officials are telling regional partners that American security guarantees are unreliable, that Washington will abandon allies whenever it becomes politically convenient, and that the smart move is to accommodate Iranian interests rather than betting on American protection. And what makes these adversary reactions so concerning is that they're not wrong in their assessments of what Trump's approach means. If America treats alliances purely as financial transactions, if security commitments are conditional on payment, then allies really can't rely on those commitments. And if allies can't rely on American commitments, then the entire post-World War II security architecture starts to crumble. Now let's talk about the domestic political reaction to Trump's foreign policy demand, because the explosive global response is being matched by intense debate within the United States, and this isn't breaking down along simple partisan lines. Within the Republican Party, there's a fundamental split between Trump loyalists who support his transactional approach and traditional national security conservatives who view his demands as catastrophically damaging. Trump supporters argue that he's finally standing up for American taxpayers, demanding that wealthy allies pay their fair share. They see his willingness to threaten withdrawal from alliances as strong negotiating tactics, but Republican foreign policy traditionalists are horrified. These are the figures who served in previous Republican administrations, who built their careers on America's alliance system, and who understand that alliances aren't just about financial burden sharing. They're strategic assets that provide America with global influence, forward defense capabilities, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic support, and they're warning that Trump's approach would destroy value far greater than any payments his demands might extract. And this split within Republican foreign policy circles is becoming increasingly public and bitter. You're seeing op-eds from former Republican secretaries of defense condemning Trump's demands. Republican senators who focus on foreign policy are distancing themselves from Trump's approach. And Republican-aligned think tanks are publishing papers explaining why treating alliances as protection rackets would be strategically disastrous. Democrats are largely unified in opposing Trump's foreign policy demand, but they face their own political challenges because Trump has tapped into real public frustration about America's global role, about whether the United States gets adequate returns on its military spending, and simply defending the status quo isn't politically viable. So Democrats are trying to thread a needle, arguing that Trump's approach is wrong while also committing to push allies for increased defense spending. But that's a difficult message because it requires nuance. And in an environment where Trump can simplify his message to make allies pay up or we leave, the Democratic counterargument sounds weak and defensive. Now let's examine the long-term implications of Trump's foreign policy demand, because the consequences extend far beyond whether these specific demands are implemented. Even if Trump doesn't win in 2024, the fact that a former president who might return to power is making these demands has already changed how countries think about their relationships with the United States. And the most immediate implication is that allies can no longer take American commitments for granted. For decades, the foundation of alliance relationships was the assumption that regardless of which party controlled the White House, America's basic treaty commitments would be honored. Trump's demands have shattered that assumption. Now allies know that America could elect a president who views alliances as transactional arrangements, who might demand payments they can't afford, or who might withdraw security guarantees. So you're seeing allied countries accelerating programs to develop more independent military capabilities. European nations are increasing defense budgets not just to meet NATO targets, but to reduce dependence on America. Japan is expanding its military. South Korea is developing more sophisticated missile capabilities. And all of this is happening because countries can no longer assume that American protection will always be available. And there are also economic and technological implications. Countries that can't rely on American security guarantees need to diversify their security relationships. That means deeper cooperation with each other, but it also means accommodating rivals like China more than they otherwise would, because countries that can't count on American protection need to hedge their bets. And the intelligence sharing relationships that are crucial to American security are also at risk, because intelligence sharing depends on trust, on the belief that partners will be reliable over the long term. But if allies think America might abandon them based on one election, they become more cautious about sharing their most sensitive intelligence. And perhaps most fundamentally, Trump's approach is accelerating the erosion of the rules-based international order that America created after World War II. Because that order was built on the premise that relationships between nations would be based on shared values and mutual interests rather than pure power politics. But if America treats alliances as protection rackets, the entire philosophical foundation of that order collapses. Now let's talk about what Trump and his advisors appear to be fundamentally misunderstanding about alliances and about American power. Because Trump seems to view alliances primarily as costs, as expenses that America bears to protect others. But that framework completely misses what alliances actually provide to the United States. American alliances aren't charity. They're investments that generate enormous returns in the form of global influence, forward defense capabilities, intelligence networks, diplomatic support, and economic integration. The ability to station troops in Germany or Japan or South Korea isn't just about protecting those countries. It's about projecting American power globally, having forward positions from which to respond to crises anywhere in the world. And the financial costs that Trump focuses on are actually quite modest relative to what America gets in return. Yes, American taxpayers fund a large military budget, but the vast majority of that spending would be necessary even without overseas commitments. The incremental cost of maintaining alliances is far smaller than the value they provide. And if America demands payments that treat alliances as protection rackets, the strategic calculus changes dramatically. Countries that are paying for American security guarantees view them as purchase services rather than mutual commitments. They feel less obligation to support American policies in other areas, and they begin exploring alternatives. So Trump could succeed in extracting more money from allies but lose far more in strategic value. Countries might pay what he demands but reduce their political support for American initiatives. They might maintain alliances on paper but hollow them out in practice. And there's a particular irony in Trump demanding that allies pay more while simultaneously pursuing policies that alienate them. Because the influence America exercises through alliances isn't just about military power, it's about being seen as a reliable partner. And Trump's transactional approach undermines all of that. So where does this leave us? What should we expect as this explosive global reaction to Trump's foreign policy demand continues to unfold? Well, in the immediate term, expect this issue to become a central focus of the 2024 presidential campaign. Democratic candidates will use Trump's demands to argue that he's fundamentally unfit to handle foreign policy. Republicans will split between defending Trump's approach and distancing themselves from demands they view as strategically reckless. and expect foreign governments to continue contingency planning for the possibility of Trump's return to power. They're not waiting to see what happens in the election. They're accelerating programs to build more independent capabilities now. Expect more details about Trump's specific demands to leak out as foreign governments and Trump advisors provide information to journalists. And expect those revelations to generate additional waves of reaction and controversy. And longer term, regardless of who wins in 2024, the damage to alliance relationships will persist. The knowledge that America could elect a president who views alliances as protection rackets can't be unlearned. The hedging strategies that countries are developing won't be abandoned, and the erosion of trust in American commitments won't be reversed by one election. If Trump does win and attempts to implement his demands, expect some allies to comply under protest while reducing their cooperation in other areas. Expect others to refuse payment and dare Trump to follow through on his threats, and expect a chaotic period where long-standing alliance relationships are renegotiated or dissolved. If Trump loses, expect a new administration to spend years trying to rebuild trust with allies, but that repair work will be harder than simply returning to the pre-Trump status quo, because allies now know that America could elect another leader who questions their entire relationship. The fundamental lesson from this explosive global reaction is that American power depends on more than military might or economic strength. It depends on being seen as a reliable partner, on maintaining alliances based on shared values, and on exercising leadership that allies want to follow. And Trump's foreign policy demand threatens all of that in ways that would weaken America far more than any rival's military buildup ever could. Stay informed. Pay attention to how this develops. Understand that what's at stake goes far beyond one election. We're watching the potential unraveling of an alliance system that has maintained peace between great powers for longer than any previous period in human history. And if you want analysis that examines these deeper implications, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one as this unprecedented crisis in American alliance relationships continues to unfold.